Have you ever been in a concert and clapped enthusiastically at the end of the third movement when there was a fourth, and maybe you just lost count? And then there was an annoyed hush. Or walked down to an opera halfway through because it looked like it was all done and dusted. I did go back, but honestly the initial impulse was the better, if not the right one. What my paper will look at, rather than reliving toe-curling moments from the past, will be the way in which various types of works end within a manuscript culture. There's lots of continuities between manuscript stroke oral culture and the present, particularly the grammar of films. So if we go back to Aristotle, good stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. Introduction, development, denouement. But I'm not really interested in that type of ending. Rather, it's the formal elements which mark that the action or contents have stopped that are interesting. These are often paralleled by the formal elements of introduction as well. Think for a moment how many papers begin by thanking the organisers. By the way, thanks Doug. And end with thanking the audience for their attention. So, thanks for sticking with me so far, guys. I will look particularly at how this plays out in two settings. The first, what we can understand of oral performance in two areas, namely legal text and epic poetry, and which we understand only through their recording in written form. And secondly, more literary works which are transmitted through copying. All these are performed and consumed orally, of course, but on the one hand, the oral texts are records of oral performances, and the literary texts are performances of written works. All are transmitted through manuscript copies. So what I'll be looking at initially is how authors themselves signal that a work has, as far as they are concerned, finished. And my major interest here are clerical authors of medieval Iberia, who wrote in a particular type of learned poetic style. I'll consider what makes an authorial ending to a work, the authorial sign-off, which we will refer to with the general word explicit. In the main then, authorial, verse, explicits. These works were generally transmitted through being contained in a codex, but nothing against rolls and scrolls, but they have their own grammar and punctuation, as it were. The codex allowed in general more than one work to be contained within itself, and the lack of physical limits could result in a sequence of works being included within the one physical object. So giving a sense of where one thing ended and another began was of some importance. The authorial explicit, then, might be considered not just as a means to say, we're done here, or give details about who, what, where, why, when, or to ask for a reward, for money, for prayers, but also to guarantee the integrity of the work, here and not further by me. Of course, works can expand beyond the original conception, and these may well be authorial expansions or bits and bobs tacked onto the end. The authorial expansion creates a new archetype, and the bits and bobs are usually added in transmission. At this point then, we move away from looking at and discovering authorial production, the touchstone of the traditional text critical approach, and we move into questions of copying and reception. And here, what scribes do is very important, and what scribes say too. Either through the scribal explicit, often cast in stereotyped terms, learnt as part of the craft, which also becomes fossilized within the tradition, usually the information this book is finished, perhaps containing a prayer or a request for blessing. Or we might get a scribal colophon, which provides the who, why, where, when of the copying. Very common, seemingly obligatory, in Armenian manuscripts, for example, much less in Latin manuscripts from the West. And I'll also be looking at how these pile up within a copying tradition. So we can have authorial explicit, scribal colophon, new explicit for performance, following hot on the heels of one another in the same manuscript. The type of aggregation that some open copying traditions are subject to may also attract a reviser or editor A copyist who takes a much more interventionist attitude to the texts that are gathered there, more or less in the same place, and will also leave his mark at the end. Also at the beginning too sometimes. I'll be concluding with a few remarks about how important these textual fragments really are, even though they exist outside of the work proper, and how much they can tell us about the crucial questions of transmission and therefore reception. At this point, it will be wise to say how they are like, but not really comparable to, the paratexts we are used to from the world of printing, and then I'll stop.